The greatest and most important problems of life are all fundamentally insoluble. They can never be solved, but only outgrown. Carl Jung. We exist within invisible architectures, belief systems, internal programs, and structures that quietly determine which scenarios are more likely to unfold in our lives. These patterns operate beneath conscious awareness, shaping not only how we interpret the world, but also how we interact with it. What appears to be coincidence, what seems like circumstance, is often simply the manifestation of these deeply embedded patterns. And here lies a curious paradox. We create difficulties for ourselves. We construct obstacles that we then expend tremendous energy trying to overcome. It's as though we're both the architect of the maze and the one searching for the exit. This phenomenon has been observed throughout psychological literature. Carl Jung spoke of the shadow, those aspects of ourselves we refuse to acknowledge, which then appear as external challenges. Fritz Perls suggested that what we perceive as problems out there are often unfinished business from within ourselves. We project our internal landscape onto the external world, and then we respond to our own projections as if they were objective reality. Consider how we approach conversations, particularly those that matter most to us. When we want to discuss something important with another person, a concern, a request, a clarification, we rarely enter that dialogue with purely clean intentions. Our words carry weight, the weight of unexamined projections, assumptions about how the other person will respond, fears of being misunderstood, and hopes that they will validate our perspective. These projections accumulate like sediment, obscuring the actual communication we claim to desire. It is remarkably unusual for us to speak from a place where we genuinely want to hear our partner. Even when we believe we're being open-minded, we often harbor a subtle insistence, an insistence that our viewpoint be accepted. We present our opinions not as offerings, but as truths requiring acknowledgement. It's simply the default mode of communication when we operate from within our roles and programs. So what would it mean to communicate differently? To remain in a position of allowing, where everyone is free to choose whether they want to engage with us, whether they agree, or whether they hold entirely different ideas. This requires something that sounds simple, but proves remarkably difficult: patience. Patience, in this sense, is not about endurance. It's not about gritting our teeth and tolerating something we find unbearable. Patience, in its truest form, is allowing others to remain who they want to be. It's the capacity to witness another person without needing them to change, to perform, or to conform to our expectations. This brings us to a critical practice: catching our projections in real time. When we look at a person and notice ourselves forming judgments, making assumptions, feeling certain we know what they're thinking, that's the moment. That's when it becomes valuable to pause, to ask, what if I've been looking at this person through a distorted lens? What if my doubts, my suspicions, my interpretations are not reflections of who they are, but rather expressions of my own internal programs? Carl Rogers emphasized unconditional positive regard, the practice of accepting another person without judgment or evaluation. But before we can offer that to others, we must first recognize how much judgment we're already projecting onto them. Outside of all our programs and preconceptions, how might this person actually manifest? What would we see if we directed a more benevolent attention toward them? This is not about naive optimism. It's about distinguishing between what is actually happening and what we assume is happening based on our past experiences and conditioning. When we notice a distortion forming, an assumption about someone's motives, a suspicion about their character, that's when we need to redirect our attention, not outward, but inward. Take your attention away from the other person for a moment and observe. You might even feel where that reaction lives in your body. Is there tightness in your chest, tension in your shoulders? And then go deeper. What lies behind that physical sensation? Is there something about you in the way you feel about that person? Often, beneath the projection, we find an old wound, a familiar fear, a pattern that has been repeating itself for years. Stay with those feelings. Observe them without judgment, without trying to fix or change them. This practice, which draws from mindfulness traditions and has been integrated into therapies, creates space between stimulus and response. It interrupts the automatic unfolding of our programs. But why does any of this matter? What's at stake in learning to communicate without projection, to relate without insisting, to observe our reactions rather than being controlled by them? The answer touches on something profound, something about how reality itself responds to our internal state. For our intentions to manifest in reality, there must be coherence. Coherence between different levels of our being. Our actions must align with our words. Our words must reflect our genuine thoughts. And our self-awareness must confirm what we express through both speech and behavior. When these elements synchronize, when we say what we think, when our body reflects our truth, when there's no internal contradiction, something shifts in how we interact with reality itself. This principle has been explored through various frameworks. Carl Jung wrote about synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that seem to occur when our internal and external worlds align. Abraham Maslow observed that self-actualized individuals experienced more of these moments, as if the universe became more responsive to their authentic presence. It's the recognition that when we live with integrity, the world becomes less resistant to our movement through it. The shortest path to a synchronistic life, where desires manifest more readily, is this coherence. When there's no split between what we think, what we say, and what we do, we stop scattering our energy across contradictions. We stop creating the very obstacles we then struggle to overcome. Another thing happens here. When we start becoming more self-observant and integrated, we don't get involved unnecessarily. And when we don't get involved, we are always in superposition. Think about this for a moment. In quantum physics, superposition describes a state where a particle exists in multiple states simultaneously until it's observed. The act of observation collapses these possibilities into one definite outcome. There's a parallel here in human consciousness. When we're not forcing, not controlling, not collapsing possibilities through our anxious need to know exactly how things will unfold, we remain open to multiple pathways. And in the moments when it seems like we are doing nothing, this state of silence is, in fact, when all of life is happening. It's our programs that insist you need to control, that you need to know exactly what you want, otherwise, what will you get? These programs create constant anxiety, a sense that if we're not actively managing every outcome, life will somehow go wrong, that stillness equals stagnation, that silence equals emptiness. But what if the opposite were true? What if, in that state of non-interference, we're actually allowing life to organize itself in ways our limited perspective could never anticipate? What if our constant involvement, our need to manipulate and direct, is actually what creates the obstacles we then struggle to overcome? The Taoist concept of Wu Wei, often translated as non-action or effortless action, points to this same principle. It's not about doing nothing, it's about acting in harmony with the natural flow of things rather than against it. It's about recognizing when our involvement creates resistance and when stepping back allows movement. This becomes possible when we stop living from roles. Consider how much of our communication is performative. We're not simply sharing what's true for us, we're trying to convey something, to convince, to shape how we're perceived. We're managing impressions, anticipating reactions, calculating outcomes. This is exhausting and inefficient. What changes when we speak from a different place, when we simply say what is close to us, what feels true in the moment, and then leave it up to others to hear us, or not? There's a remarkable freedom in this. The most important element becomes the authentic expression itself, not whether it's received as instruction, whether it changes anyone's mind, or whether it earns approval. When we release attachment to being understood, to being recognized, to having our perspective validated, when we no longer need those secondary benefits, we step outside the machinery of roles and programs. This is what it means to communicate without agenda, and suddenly, this is often when genuine connection becomes possible. But how do we know if we're still operating from within our roles? How do we recognize when we're still caught in our beliefs and programs? The answer lies in our reactions. If there's discomfort when someone ignores our words, frustration when they misunderstand, hurt when they disagree, these emotional responses are signals. They indicate that we're still invested in a particular outcome, still seeking something from the interaction beyond honest expression. The practice, then, is to remain observant of these reactions, not to judge ourselves for having them, but to notice them with curiosity and openness. We always have a split second, that brief window between stimulus and response where choice exists. How do I want to react this time? Do I want to respond from the old program, or is there another possibility? Viktor Frankl, who survived concentration camps and went on to develop logotherapy, wrote that between stimulus and response there is a space, and in that space lies our freedom. It's a practical skill that can be developed through consistent attention. Try to keep track of these moments, watch them accumulate, notice patterns. Something remarkable happens as this practice deepens. Your understanding begins to change, not just intellectually, but in your direct awareness of what people are actually saying and what they truly want to convey. You start to distinguish between the content of their words and the roles they're playing, between their stated positions and their underlying beliefs. This skill, stepping out of all roles and prejudices, proves invaluable. Because when people are entrenched in their roles, operating fully from within their programs and beliefs, they primarily want to express themselves. They're broadcasting, not receiving. But when we step out of our own roles, we develop the capacity to understand more clearly what others are trying to convey beneath their performance. We become listeners in the truest sense, not people waiting for our turn to speak, but witnesses to another's authentic self, even when that self is hidden beneath layers of conditioning. And in that witnessing, something shifts. The conversation becomes less about competing narratives and more about genuine contact between human beings. This is not just a technique to master, it's a way of being that emerges when we consistently choose awareness over automaticity, when we value truth over validation, and when we allow rather than insist. The programs will continue to run. Belief systems don't disappear overnight. The voice that says, "You need to control this, you need to know exactly what you want, otherwise what will you get?" That voice may still speak. But we no longer have to be unconscious passengers. We can observe it, question it, and in each moment decide whether it serves us or simply repeats the past. This is where real transformation begins, not in grand gestures or dramatic revelations, but in these small moments of choice. These split seconds where we catch ourselves about to react from an old program, and instead we pause, we feel, we observe, we allow, we choose. And gradually, almost imperceptibly, the quality of our experience changes. We find ourselves less reactive, more present, less driven by the need to prove, convince, or control, more at ease with uncertainty, more fulfilled. Our relationships begin to change, not because we've mastered some technique, but because we're showing up differently, more authentically, less defensively, and more willing to truly hear another person, rather than simply waiting to be heard. And life itself becomes more synchronistic, because we've stopped collapsing possibilities prematurely through our anxious need to control. The world we experience is, in large part, the world we create through these choices, through these moment-by-moment decisions about whether to engage from our programs or from our presence, whether to control or to allow. The world can change when we do.